Our next speaker is PhD student Sarah Pears. When she was little, she had an imaginary friend named Patty. She has raced in an Olympic distance triathlon. She dreamed of opening her own small restaurant called the Slapdash Cafe. Please welcome Sarah.
Hi. So an important piece of information that hasn't been mentioned yet and is not up on my slide is I am a PhD student with Kimberly Wallen in her lab. I kind of feel like I don't really need to give an introduction anymore, because if you were here for Jen's talk, she did a pretty good job of covering what Windstorm and Salvage harvest, what those processes are. And then Matthias covered adaptive management, which this also touches on. And then Steph at the beginning of the session covered climate change. So I kind of feel like I should just skip to my results slides, but I won't. Before I go any further, though, I do have to say I did prepare an interpretive dance for this. But since Tatiana has been very strict about people standing in front of the microphone, you're going to miss out on that today. And if you want to see the interpretive dance, then you need to come to my dissertation defense. Okay, so this is kind of my very simplistic model of how a disturbance works in ecosystems. So we have a certain ecological structure and composition, and it's going through a continual process of succession. So the physical structure and the species composition in forests is constantly changing, and this is a different kind of view than what scientists were really thinking about maybe 15 years ago. We were talking more about climax forests and how important climax forests were, and we don't really talk that way anymore about ecosystems. We recognize that ecosystems are constantly changing. There's constant turnover of species, at least on some scale, and changes in structure. And so you can imagine that this is just a little segment of really a continuum through time, that ecosystems are continually undergoing succession and disturbance over time. But what happens when we interject some kind of management in this system? Management also often comes after a disturbance, so after one of those big disturbance events that Jen mentioned earlier, fire out west, insect outbreaks in the Northeast, and really the eastern U.S. Windstorms are the big disturbance events, so hurricanes like the 1938 hurricane, tornadoes, even smaller localized downburst events, microbursts constitute disturbances in eastern forests. And often we have a management response, again, similar to what Jen was saying, whether that's driven by an emotional response to seeing a mature forest be reduced to a pile of logs, or wanting to restore some kind of recreation access, or using the salvage harvest as a potential way to cover property damages. Salvage harvest is one way that we kind of follow up disturbance with the management. And in particular, there's been quite a bit of research around windstorms and post-windstorm management. And a lot of these studies ask whether different management prescriptions result in different trajectories of succession and ultimately ecological structure and composition. So a big question is this what's happening? Are we when we apply different management scenarios, are we fundamentally changing the trajectory of these ecosystems in terms of their structure and composition? Or are these ecosystems resilient and they all kind of converge back at a similar structure and composition? And what's the time frame for that? How quickly do they converge if that's happening? So again, I am studying windstorm event. In this case, it's a series of microbursts that happened December 1st, 2010. This just barely predates. It's the same year that, it was the December previous to Hurricane Irene. So Hurricane Irene completely eclipsed this damage in kind of this disturbance in sort of the public view. If people didn't have windstorm damage on their property, they probably don't really think about it because Irene came through and just completely changed the landscape. But this windstorm followed several days of heavy rain, so the soils are really saturated. And the valley wind gusts, so in Williston, the highest wind gusts were 50 miles an hour. Typically, wind gusts in Williston are about 20 miles an hour. So this was a significant wind event. Gusts were as high as 100 miles an hour over Mount Mansfield. I've been up there when wind gusts have been maybe 30, 40 miles an hour. I do not want to be up there when it's 100 miles an hour. And so after this wind event, salvage harvest happened on private and public lands, and similar to what Jen was reporting, the method of salvage harvest, the intensity of salvage harvest really varied between ownership and even between stands within an ownership. So the salvage harvest kind of captures a real range of management within this sort of collection of treatment. So these are my fundamental questions. First, does salvage harvest change forest structure or composition? And so in terms of forest structure, I was looking at coarse woody debris, standing dead trees, live trees, saplings, and seedlings. And then forest composition, I was looking at herbaceous vegetation layer and seedling sapling species richness, diversity, and abundance. We collected our data 2013 to 2014, so this is 3 to 4 years post wind and salvage. There have been other researchers who have tried to kind of again determine where that time frame is, if those management trajectories change forest structure and composition, and then forest structure and composition converges again, what time does that happen? So for me, on the time scale of doing a PhD, I was able to look at 3 to 4 years post wind and salvage. So this is just a map of my research sites. So all my sites are in Chittenden County, which is the county that we're sitting in. And they're all on sort of the western slope of the Green Mountains. The study sites range from 4/10 of an acre to about 4/10 of a hectare to about 4 hectares, but some of the patches, the blowdown patches that I saw, were as large as 20 hectares. So the size of the disturbance was really variable. All of the sites are within about 35 kilometers of each other, and all were white pine dominated before the windstorm in 2010. So this is my experimental design. This is an opportunistic study that took advantage of the occurrence of a windstorm and salvage harvest. So you can see that the design is super unbalanced because I was basically working with what was available on the landscape. So I have 3 control sites or reference sites where there was no windstorm, there wasn't any recent salvage or harvest. 3 sites where there was windstorm damage but no salvage harvest. 14 sites where there was salvage harvest that followed the windstorm, and then 1 site where the landowner salvage harvested after the windstorm and then actually pulled all the stumps and graded the topsoil off. Why? I don't know. But it gives me an extreme case of cumulative disturbance. In terms of methods, we looked at we measured coarse woody debris along transects at every site. And the sort of qualifying parameters for a piece of coarse woody debris was that it was dead. It was actually dead and not just lying on the ground with roots still connected. That it was more than 45 degrees from vertical, or less than 45 degrees from horizontal, and that the diameter at the intersection with our transect was greater than 7 centimeters. Thank you. And so I performed a one-way ANOVA and Tsukie's honestly significant difference tests, and as you might imagine, or as we expected, the highest coarse woody debris volume is in the sites that had wind damage, but not salvage harvest. And really, this is the only significantly different site among the 4 treatment types. So that's ho-hum, not surprising. We also looked at standing dead trees, and we measured diameter at 1.4 meters above ground. And we also looked at remnant live canopy trees. Here, we didn't see any differences between the dead trees, standing dead trees, but we did see significant differences in the live trees between the control sites and the wind and salvage harvest sites. No difference between the 2 wind and salvage harvest sites treatments. So again, this is not surprising. When wind blows down trees, they die. We also measured seedling and sapling density. There's really no change in sapling density, which isn't surprising because saplings tend to be the least impacted by these kinds of windstorms. They're protected by overstory trees, and they tend to survive windstorms, so there's usually not a lot of change. I was surprised to see no significant difference among my treatments in seedlings. I would have expected to see higher seedling densities in wind and salvage because of a release of resources, light and soil nutrients. So to answer this question on whether or not salvage harvest changes forage structure, yes, it decreases coarse woody debris, doesn't affect dead standing trees, doesn't seem to affect live trees relative to stands that have only had wind disturbance, doesn't affect wind, doesn't affect saplings, and salvage harvest doesn't either. And seedlings aren't impacted either, but I'm curious as to why that's the case. In terms of biodiversity, we looked at herbaceous vegetation, and I analyzed this using non-metric multidimensional scaling, which is a statistics method that collapses many data vectors, in this case species, into just a few axes, and this makes visualization and interpretation possible. So if I was seeing differences in my treatments in terms of herbaceous species, I would expect that I would expect the colored dots to kind of separate. So green dots all in one spot, red dots in one spot, black dots in one spot, and see kind of some differentiation among those groups. I don't see that, so there's essentially no significant difference among treatments in terms of the herbaceous vegetation diversity. And that's actually borne out by the species richness test and species diversity tests, no significant differences among treatments. So this is actually a surprising result. On an individual species basis, there were some species that responded. Thank you. In particular, striped maple was about 16 times, covered about 16 times more area in wind-thrown sites than salvage sites. Big-tooth aspen. Aspen seems to be a big concern among landowners. They don't really want their forests to be taken over by what they refer to as popple, typically. Big-tooth aspen was about 10 times higher in control sites and wind-thrown sites than salvage harvest sites. So bottom line is salvage harvest as a management does not increase the density of popple. And salvage harvest significantly. Sorry, this is the popple. That's the red maple, and wind and salvage does decrease red maple seedling density. So, in conclusion, in terms of the stand structure, we do see potentially some differentiation in the trajectories of these stands, but we don't see that in composition. And I don't think I have time for questions, but thank you.
Thank you.
We have some questions anyway.
Sure.
Sarah, can I ask you a question about the salvage logging effects?
Sure.
On structure. I found that really perplexing that we didn't see an effect in the data set on individual live trees and all the different signals. And I wonder if that's just that there's, when you're looking at absolute values like densities or basal area or something like that, there's enough noise in your data set that you don't see a change. But if they salvage logged it, that means they had to have cut something, right? So by definition, something's been removed.
Right.
So what if you change that into a percent change or a percent difference pre to post salvage on each site, and you used a different metric that captured sort of direct effect of the salvage operation on each site? If you see what I'm saying?
That would be great, and I would love to be able to do that,
You know, the pre.
but I don't have the pre-salvage.
Can you
Yeah.
use your reference as the pre?
Potentially. Yeah, it's something that I haven't kind of made explicit in the analysis, but I could do that. Yeah. Mark.
I was interested in the seedling analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Where it says that you did not see much difference between salvaged and not salvaged. Which actually makes some sense. Because you were going in there 3 or 4 years after the windstorm and the salvage.
Mm-hmm.
And so both sites had an awful lot of light going on.
Yes.
But what would have caused a difference?
Soil disturbance is a possibility, and that's not something that I measured. I was also kind of curious as to whether there would be possibly an influence of shade from all the piles of coarse woody debris. I mean, we're talking about big chunks of coarse woody debris in the wind-grown sites that weren't salvaged, and those piles were reduced in places that were salvage harvested. But
Deer probably there.
and that could be another factor. Although Vermont's deer population is not as it's not as high as I've seen it in other places. Like if we were to do this kind of project in like Pennsylvania, where the deer population is really high, we might see more of a difference between windstorm damaged sites that still had coarse woody debris in place to protect seedlings, and salvage sites that didn't have that kind of natural deer fencing phenomenon going on.